Welcome to my channel. In today's video, we are going to take a look at the theory of consumer behavior, and we're going to start with utility. So, the objective of today's course is to go through the various terminologies relating to the theory of consumer behavior. That's utility, total utility, average utility, marginal utility, and dish utility. We also check the law of diminishing marginal utility. From there, we take a look at the relationship between total, marginal, and average utility. From there, we also take a look at the relationship between marginal utility, price, and quantity demanded. Then, also, equilibrium of the consumer surplus, and the last chapter, we end with the paradox of value. So, let's get into it. So, when we say utility is simply the amount of satisfaction that a consumer derives from the consumption of a commodity at a given time. So, example, if you drink water to quench your thirst, the satisfaction that you derive from taking in the water to quench your thirst, that is what is termed as utility. So, maybe if you take water, you take in Coke, Fanta, or if you ride to school or take in apple, the satisfaction that you derive from all these, that's what is termed as utility. So with the concept of utility, there are two main schools of thought. We have the cardinalist approach and we have the ordinalist approach. So according to the cardinalist, they are of the view that the satisfaction that one derives from consumption of any commodity can be measured or is measurable. And the unit for measuring is called utils. What does this mean? So maybe if you are thirsty and you take in water to quench your thirst, the satisfaction that you derive from it, according to them, they say you can assign a value to it. And the value can be from 0 to an infinite number. In contrast, the ordinalist approach also says, no, the satisfaction that one derives from consumption of a commodity cannot be measured, but rather it can be ranked. Thus, maybe between Coke and Fanta, you can say, oh, okay, maybe I prefer Coca-Cola to Fanta. But you can't assign a value to it. That's the ordinalist approach. But today we are going to take a look at the cardinalist approach, that's utility. In the subsequent chapters or the next video, maybe you will take a look at indifference curve, that's going by the ordinalist approach. Okay. So when we say total utility, what is total utility? It is the total amount of satisfaction that a consumer derives from the consumption of units of a particular commodity at a given time. What does this mean? So maybe, for example, you are very thirsty. That's after returning from PE class. You are very thirsty. You decide to take 5 bottles of water. So you took the first one, the second one, the third one, up to the 5th one. Mind you, the first bottle gives you some level of satisfaction. The second bottle also gives you some level of satisfaction. Up to the 5th bottle, which will also give you some level of satisfaction. So when you sum all these satisfaction that you get from each bottle of water that you consume, that is what is termed as the total utility. Okay, mathematically, it can be represented as the sum of marginal utilities to the nth utility, or the average utility times the quantity that you consume. So let's move on. As time goes on, I'll explain it well. So the next one is average utility. What's average utility then? Average utility is the per unit of the quantity of the commodity consumed. So maybe if you consume a commodity, let's say our water example, you consume 5 bottles of water, and when you had a total utility of say 20, what will the average utility be then? Then it's going to be the total utility divided by the number of bottles that you consumed. So in this example, it's going to be 20 divided by 5, and you are going to get 4. So that means on average, you are getting a utility or an average utility of 4 utils. Okay, then we move on to marginal utility. Marginal utility, on the other hand, is the additional satisfaction that a consumer derives from the consumption of an additional unit of a commodity. What does this mean? As you keep consuming more and more of a commodity, each additional unit that you consume gives you a different level of satisfaction. So our water example, the first bottle of water gives you a certain level of satisfaction. If your thirst is not well quenched, you go in for the second bottle. After taking the second bottle, you realize that still your thirst is not well quenched. So you go in for the third bottle. Each bottle that you take gives you a certain level of satisfaction. So that level of satisfaction that each bottle of water gives you, that is what is referred to as the marginal utility from that bottle. Okay, so mathematically too, you can represent that one by a change in total utility divided by a change in the quantity. That's the TU n, where the n is the new total utility, minus TUO, that's the total utility, old total utility, divided by the new quantity, that's QN, minus the old quantity, that's QO. So, as the lesson goes on, I'll use numerical examples to explain so you can get the various concepts. Now, the last concept with utility or terminology is disutility. What is disutility then? Disutility is the dissatisfaction or displeasure that a consumer derives from the consumption of a commodity. So whenever you consume a commodity and you are dissatisfied with it, that level of dissatisfaction, that is what is termed as disutility. Okay, so let's move on. Now, let's examine the relationship between total utility, marginal utility, and average utility. We are still sticking to our water example. So, for example, you came from PE class and you are very thirsty. So, you asked a friend for water. A friend gave you one bottle of water and you took it. After you finished taking the water, you assigned a value of 20 to the satisfaction that you derived from that first bottle of water. He said, okay, I liked it, so I'm assigning a value of 20 utils to it. When you are asked, then what is the total utility that you've obtained from the water then? Because it is the only bottle of water that you've taken, the marginal utility, which is 20, will also be equal to that of the total utility. That's 20 utils. What about the average? If you're asked, what is the average utility of this bottle of water that you've taken? Realize that from our formula, its average utility is equal to the total utility divided by the quantity that is consumed. So here, it's going to be 20 divided by 1. That's just one bottle of water that you've consumed. So the average utility will also be equal to 20. Okay, now, after the first bottle of water, you said, I still want more because I'm still thirsty. So you were given the second bottle of water. After taking the second bottle of water, you said, okay, now I'm assigning a value of 16 utils to it. That's the level of satisfaction this time around. You are assigning 16 utils to it. So what would your total utility also be then in this time around? That's after consuming the second unit. You realize that the first bottle of water gave you a marginal utility of 20. The second bottle of water, you are assigning a utility, or is giving you a utility of 16 utils. Therefore, the total utility after the consumption of the second unit or second bottle of water is going to be the sum of the first marginal utility and the second marginal utility, which is going to give you 36. So, we realize that to get the total utility of the second unit, it was the sum of the marginal utility of the first unit and the second unit consumed. From our formula, there are two main formulas or two key formulas to compute the total utility. Either you use the sum of the marginal utility. So in this example, we are using the second formula. Okay, now, how do you compute the average utility then? From the formula, we are saying that average utility is total utility divided by the quantity. So to get the average utility for the second unit of, or second bottle of water consumed, then it's going to be 36, that's the total utility, divided by 2, that's the quantity of bottle of water that we've taken, and that gives us 18. Okay, so after taking the second bottle of water, you still said you weren't satisfied, so you went in for the third bottle of water. After taking the third bottle of water, you assigned it a marginal utility of 9. So now, giving it a marginal utility of 9 and consuming 3 bottles of water, what will your total utility be then? It's going to be 20, that's the utility from the first bottle of water, plus 16, that's the utility from the second bottle of water, and 9, that's the utility from the third bottle of water. So you sum everything and then you get 45. So from the formula, the total utility from the third bottle of water can be given as the marginal utility from the first bottle plus the marginal utility from the second bottle plus the marginal utility from the third bottle. That should give you the total utility for the third bottle of water consumed. Then our average utility, as usual, becomes the total utility, which in this case is 45, divided by 3, and that gives us 15. So you realize that as you keep increasing the number of bottles of water that you are consuming, your marginal utility keeps decreasing. So if you are to continue with it, you pick a fourth bottle of water and then you assign it a value or a utility of 5 utils. So with the 5 utils, then our total utility in this case is going to be 50. How? Because it's going to be the 45 from the previous 3 bottles plus the 5 utils from the 4th bottle of water. So when you add it, you are going to get 50. And the average utility becomes 12.5. So let's autofill our table. Okay, so let's say we keep continuing with this same analysis till the 8th unit of bottle. You realize that if you take the 5th bottle of water, our marginal utility is going to fall from 5 units to 4 units, causing the total utility to increase to 54. And our average utility is going to be 10.8. And by the 6th unit, by the time you are giving the 6th bottle of water, you feel like you are totally satisfied. So you wouldn't be taking the 6th unit or the 6th bottle of water. What that happens is, then the total utility becomes that of the last unit that you consumed. That's the 5th unit. Because you wouldn't be consuming the 6th bottle. At that point, your marginal utility is 0. Okay, but for whatever reason, maybe you challenged a friend that you can take the 7th bottle. You went ahead and then you took the 7th bottle. Because you were totally satisfied, you realize that you are going to throw up. And then, even the water that I've already taken earlier is going to come out. And this is going to give you a disutility. That is why you are getting a negative value. And disutility always take away from your total utility. So as the marginal utility enters negative, begin to see that the values for the total utility is decreasing. So now, let's check the relationship. From the values in the total utility column, we realize that as we keep increasing the number of bottles of water that we are taking, the values keeps increasing. That's from 20, 36, 45, 50, 54. Up to 54, it remains constant over there. And then it began to fall from 54 to 52 and then 58. So if you had to increase the value, we realize that it will keep falling and falling and falling. But in contrast, as the quantity keeps increasing, or the number of bottles of water keeps increasing, we realize that the marginal utility values keeps falling and falling and falling to a point that it gets to 0 and then enters the negative. The same thing applies to the average utility. Average utility also keeps falling and falling and falling. But compare the average utility to the marginal utility. We realize that marginal utility falls faster than the average utility. So if you are to plot these values on a graph, this is what we are going to get. So the total utility consuming the first bottle of water was 20. That's why the curve is starting from 20. And from the values, we realize that the values were increasing. That's from 20, 36, 45 upward until the fifth bottle. That gave us the 54. And upon the seed consumption too, the total utility was constant. From the curve, you realize that it's increasing but at a decreasing rate till the seed bottle of water. At that point, the total utility was at its maximum. Beyond the seed bottle, it started decreasing. That's from 54 to 52. And you see that the curve is decreasing beyond this point. Okay, that of the values of the marginal utility is represented by the green curve. We realize that it also started from 20 utils upon consuming the first bottle of water. These values were decreasing as more and more bottles of water were consumed, till at the point where marginal utility was 0. And you realize that marginal utility was 0 at the point where the total utility was at its maximum. Then we can trace the average utility curve too. And you realize that with the average utility, it's also falling as well. But because marginal utility is falling faster than average utility, that is why the marginal utility curve lies below the average utility curve. What do we mean by the marginal utility falling faster than the average utility? If you have to compare the values, the rate at which marginal utility is falling from the first bottle of water to the second bottle of water, we have a difference of 4. Whilst on the average utility column, from the first bottle to the second bottle, we have a difference of 2. And this is true as the values keep falling and falling for the marginal utility and that of the average utility. So let's establish something here. We can see that as marginal utility was 0, the total utility was at its maximum. Okay, so let's check the differences or the relationship between these 3 concepts. 1, we say that with the first unit consumed, total utility is equal to marginal utility and is equal to average utility. Let's check. So, for the first bottle of water, we realize that total utility was 20, marginal utility was 20, and average utility was also 20. And that is why they all start from the same point, because upon the first consumption of the bottle of water, the total utility was equal to the marginal utility and was also equal to the average utility. The second relationship is that as more and more of the commodity is consumed, total utility rises at a diminishing rate. So let's see. We realize that as more and more of the commodity is being consumed, that's the quantity axis, as we keep consuming from 1, 2, 3, 4, we realize that the curve keeps increasing and increasing, but it increases at a diminishing rate because the component of the total utility is the marginal utility. That's the sum of the marginal utility. Yet the marginal utility keeps falling and falling. So as it keeps falling, adding them up will cause the total utility to increase, but at a diminishing or at a decreasing rate. That's the second relationship. Yet marginal utility and average utility falls throughout, and it can be seen from the diagram too. Realize that in as much as total utility was increasing, marginal utility and average utility were both falling. And because the marginal utility was falling from the table, we realize that the marginal utility was falling faster than the average utility. The marginal utility lies below the average utility. Now, the third point. Total utility is at its maximum when marginal utility is 0. From the table, we realize that at the maximum point, 54, marginal utility was 0. At this point, the consumer is getting no satisfaction from the commodity or the bottle of water that he or she will be consuming. And from the graph, we realize that at quantity 6, total utility was at its maximum or at its peak, whilst the marginal utility was 0 here. Okay. Then the fourth point. Total utility falls when marginal utility attains negative value. We can see that beyond the sealed bottle of water, marginal utility enters into the negative y-axis. That's why we have the negative 10 here. As it enters into the negative, then the total utility begins to fall. Because once you are witnessing or you are experiencing a disutility, then it's going to take away from the total utility that you derive from that commodity. And it can be seen from the values here. You realize that at the peak of 54 utils, marginal utility was 0. Being 0, when the consumer falls to consume the 7th unit, he or she is going to derive a negative disutility or a negative utility. That's a disutility of negative 2. And since the component of the total utility is the sum of all the marginal utility, the current plus the previous ones, this negative value is going to take away from the total utility and going to cause the total utility to fall. And that is why as marginal utility enters into the negative, then the total utility begins to fall. Point 5. As more of a commodity is consumed, marginal utility falls faster than average utility. Hence, the marginal utility curve must always be below the average utility curve. And it can be seen from the diagram. That is why the green curve, that's MU, is below the blue curve, that's average utility. Because when the values are falling, marginal utility falls faster than average utility. In view of that, the MU curve always will lie below the AU curve. Then the last relationship. The average utility can only be 0 when total utility is 0, but it hardly happens. Why? Because we know that the average utility is the ratio of the total utility to the quantity demanded. And the total utility values can never be 0. It can fall, alright, but it can never be 0, or it can never be negative. In view of that, average utility can never be 0, or it can never be a negative value. That is why with a curve, the average utility curve does not touch the x-axis. Because if it touches the x-axis, it means it's attaining a negative value. But average utility can never be negative or 0. Okay, so that's all for the relationship between total utility, marginal utility, and average utility. Now, let's discuss the law of diminishing marginal utility. What does the law state? The law of diminishing marginal utility states that all other things being equal, as more and more of a particular commodity is consumed, the marginal utility derived from that commodity diminishes. How? So, back to our example. As you keep drinking or taking in the bottle of water one after the other, from the first unit, we had a marginal utility of 20. Upon consuming the second unit, we realized that the marginal utility derived from the second bottle was decreasing. That it decreased from 20 to 16. We went ahead and then we took the third bottle. The utility fell from 16 to 9. How does it happen? Because you realize that as you keep consuming a commodity over and over and over, the satisfaction that you derive from that commodity begins to fall. So, it's a plate of rice. You love maybe fried rice or jollof rice. You begin to take it one after the other. After the first plate, you still want more. You are given the second plate, giving the third plate. Now you begin to realize that you are getting satisfied. So now the rate at which, even if you are going to take the fourth plate, the rate at which you are going to even eat the fourth plate is going to be very slow because you are getting satisfied to the point that you think, okay, you can't take any more, so you are no longer going to eat. So let's see the relationship between marginal utility, price, and then quantity demanded of a commodity. So the first relationship is that the marginal utility and quantity demanded of a commodity are inversely related. What does it mean? It means as you keep increasing the consumption of a commodity, the marginal utility that you derive from that commodity keeps falling and falling and falling. So from this example that we have here, realize that as you consume the first unit of that commodity, the marginal utility was 45. When you increased the quantity from 1 to 2, the additional satisfaction that you derived from the second plate fell to 34. When you increased the consumption to the third quantity, the utility also fell from 34 to 26. So it can be observed that as you keep increasing the quantity of the commodity that you always take, then the additional satisfaction that you derive from that commodity will be falling in relation to the quantity that you take. So the more you take the quantity of that commodity, the lesser satisfaction that you derive from it. So there is an inverse relationship between marginal utility and then the quantity demanded of that commodity. What about the relationship between marginal utility and price? We say that there is a direct relationship between marginal utility and the price of a commodity. What does this mean? It means that whenever the price of a commodity falls, then the additional satisfaction that one derives from that commodity will also fall. And when the price increases, then that means the additional satisfaction that one also derives is going to increase. How? From our example here, realize that the first quantity of that commodity was being sold for $60. At that $60, we are deriving a utility of 45 utils. With this 45 utils, we consume the second unit, and then our satisfaction or the additional satisfaction was falling. So it fell to 34. Now that you are having a lesser satisfaction for that commodity, you only pay a price which is lesser than the previous or the initial price. That's the only thing that will motivate you to pay or to consume the second unit. This is because for the second unit, you are deriving a utility of 34, which is lesser than the first unit or that of the first unit. So to pay for the second unit, then the price of that commodity has to be less before you pay for the second unit. When you come to the third unit, now you are deriving a satisfaction of 26 utils. With these 26 utils, before you be willing to buy the third commodity, then the price has to fall before you be willing to buy the third quantity of that commodity. So you realize that as your utility keeps falling, you always be willing to pay less and less of the price in order to get the quantity that you want. Because compared to the utility of 45, that's the first unit, to the last unit, which is 7 utils. From the seed unit or the seed quantity, you are deriving just 7 utils from that. In view of that, you wouldn't be willing to pay a higher price, that's $60 for the seed unit, because with the seed unit, you are not getting as much as more satisfaction than that of the first unit. So you realize that there is a direct relationship between the marginal utility and the price, because for you to buy the next unit, price has to decrease because you are deriving less satisfaction from the previous commodity. Because you are deriving a less satisfaction than the utility that you derived from the previous commodity. So from this example, when you consume the first unit, you had a utility of 45. When you consume the second unit, you had a utility of 34, which is smaller than consuming that, which is smaller than the utility that you derived from the first unit. So you'll be willing to pay less of that amount to get the second unit. Upon consuming the third unit, you are deriving a satisfaction of 26 utils, which is also lesser than that of the first unit and then the second unit as well. So in view of that, because the satisfaction is less, you'll be willing to pay a lesser amount or a lesser price for that commodity. So you realize that as your utility is falling, then you'll be willing to pay less price for that commodity. Okay, so the last relationship is price and quantity demanded are inversely related. This can be seen from the table here. Now let's use the graph to explain this. Realize that at quantity, at price $60, the quantity demanded of that commodity was 1. So at price 60, the consumer will be buying or is willing to buy just 1 unit. When the price fell from 60 to 55, the consumer bought the second unit, or the quantity demanded in this case was 2. As the price keeps falling, we realize that the quantity demanded of that commodity keeps increasing till the last unit that was bought. And this is because the marginal utility is also falling. And once the consumer is deriving less and less satisfaction from consuming that commodity, the only way to persuade him or her to buy more of that commodity is to lower the price. So because he or she is deriving a less satisfaction from it, you have to lower the price to get him or her to buy the commodity. And that is why the price of a commodity and then the quantity demanded of it is inversely related, because marginal utility and quantity demanded are inversely related. That means as you keep consuming more and more of the commodity, your marginal utility keeps falling as you keep consuming an additional unit of that commodity. In view of that, the consumer will be willing to pay less of the price to get or to achieve the next unit, because as he or she is consuming more and more of that commodity, the satisfaction that he is deriving, that's the additional satisfaction he or she is deriving, keeps falling and falling and falling. And that is why the price of a commodity is inversely related to the quantity demanded of that commodity. Now, when is consumer said to be at equilibrium? So, equilibrium of the consumer is a stable condition where the consumer is maximizing his satisfaction so that there is no need for him to either increase or decrease his or her satisfaction, all other things being equal. So the point at which you feel okay, you are okay with whatever thing that you are buying, you are okay with the price, the satisfaction that you place on that commodity is equal to the value or the monetary value that you are willing to buy that commodity for. That is what is termed as the equilibrium condition. And in a single commodity case, that's a situation whereby you are consuming just one commodity. we say that the consumer will be at equilibrium when the marginal utility of the commodity that he's consuming is equal to the price that he or she is willing to pay for it. So, our water example, the consumer will be said to be in equilibrium if the price that he's paying for that additional bottle of water is equal to the satisfaction that he or she would derive from consuming that bottle of water. So that is why in many cases we can say that, or a friend will buy something and you say it's very expensive. It's because the utility that you derive or you place on that commodity is not equal to the price. So you feel like it's expensive. But that friend bought it because the utility that he or she places on that thing worth buying. And he or she was at equilibrium. That is why he or she bought that commodity. So what happens then when there is disequilibrium? There are two situations that can cause the disequilibrium. The first scenario is when your marginal utility is greater than the price that you are paying for a commodity. So whenever your marginal utility is greater than the price that you pay for a commodity, all that it means is that you are deriving a higher level of satisfaction than the price that you pay for that commodity. That is why when something sounds cheap in your ears, you want to buy more. That is because you are placing higher value on it, and that is why you feel it's cheap, and then you want to buy more and more of it. And because of that situation, you're willing to buy more and more of that commodity. And as you buy more and more, you consume. And as we've already seen from the previous slide, that the quantity demanded or the quantity that we consume is inversely related to the marginal utility. As you keep consuming more and more of that commodity, the marginal utility that you derive from it will fall till the marginal utility is equal to the price again. When that happens, then equilibrium is restored. In case 2, there can be a situation where the marginal utility is less than the price of that commodity. So whenever your marginal utility is less than the commodity, then that means the consumer derives less satisfaction from that commodity. It means the price is higher than the utility that he or she is deriving from it. So when that happens, the consumer will derive or is going to demand less and consume less and less of that commodity. And since quantity demanded is inversely related to the marginal utility, as you consume less and less and less of that commodity, then your marginal utility will begin to increase. And as it increases, then the marginal utility moves back and then equates to the price of that commodity, and then equilibrium is also restored. So this is a single commodity case. That's when the consumer is consuming just one unit of a commodity. Let's see where a consumer is consuming 2 or more commodities. The consumer will be at equilibrium where the marginal utility of the commodity is proportional to their prices. So if you are consuming commodity X and commodity Y, the consumer will be in equilibrium where the ratio of the marginal utility of commodity X to the price of commodity X is equal to the ratio of the marginal utility of commodity Y to the price of commodity Y. That means the penny or the cent that you spend on commodity X, the marginal utility that you derive from that commodity should be the same or should be equal to that same amount that you are spending it on commodity Y should give you the same utility from the consumption of commodity Y. Okay, so in this instance too, there are 2 cases where there can be a disequilibrium. The first instance is when the ratio of marginal utility of commodity X to the price of commodity X is greater than the marginal utility of commodity Y to that of the price of commodity Y. This implies that the marginal utility per cedi spent or per dollar or the currency spent on commodity X is higher than the marginal utility per cedi spent on commodity Y. So to restore equilibrium in this condition or in this situation, the consumer must consume more of commodity X and consume less of commodity Y. Why? Because the consumer is deriving more satisfaction from commodity X than that of commodity Y. So to restore equilibrium, then the consumer has to consume more and more of commodity X. As he keeps consuming more and more of commodity X, what happens is the marginal utility of commodity X begins to fall. So it will fall to a point where the marginal utility derived from commodity X will be equal to the marginal utility derived from commodity Y. And in that instance, we are going to restore the equilibrium condition. In the second case, where the marginal utility or the ratio of marginal utility of commodity X to that of the price of commodity X is less than the ratio of marginal utility of commodity Y to the price of commodity Y. In this instance, what that means is the utility derived from the consumption of commodity X is lesser than the marginal utility per cedi spent on the commodity Y. When this happens, then the consumer has to consume less and less of commodity X. As the consumer consumes less and less of commodity X, then the marginal utility of commodity X increases to a point at which the marginal utility of commodity X is equal to the marginal utility of commodity Y. Let's take a look at consumer surplus. What is consumer surplus? So consumer surplus is a measure of the difference between the expenditure which the consumer would have made on the good consumed and the actual expenditure made on that good consumed. What does this mean? There are instances where you go to the market and you have a budget. You have a price at which you are willing to pay for a commodity. So you go to the market and then they tell you, okay, what do you want to buy? Okay, I want to buy a commodity. And then the consumer will be willing to pay, or he or she has budgeted to pay for the good at 500 cedis. Maybe that's a footwear. So for example, if a consumer is willing to pay 500 cedis for a footwear, but was later able to negotiate with whoever is selling the commodity and was able to buy that commodity or the footwear for 450 cedis. His consumer surplus in this instance becomes, or in this case becomes 50 cedis. So here it is the difference between the amounts that he was willing to pay, that's the 500 cedis, and how much he ended up paying for that commodity. That's 450 cedis in this case. So the surplus, that consumer surplus here is the 50 cedis. How much he was able to retain from that 500 cedis at which he was willing to buy that commodity at the initial stage. That's the 500 cedis. So whenever you go to the market and you want to buy something and you're able to negotiate with whoever is selling it and then you buy it at a lesser price or at a cheaper price, then whatever amount that you are left with, that becomes your consumer surplus. Now let's take a look at the paradox of value. What is paradox of value then? So the paradox of value states that if a commodity exists in limited quantities, it will have a higher marginal utility and as much attract higher value, while commodity that exists in unlimited quantities will have a lower marginal utility and as such it will attract a lower value. So have you ever asked yourself why water, that's very, very essential to life, is cheap, but gold, diamonds, jewels that are not that essential to life are very, very expensive? Okay, then paradox of value explains it. We realize that water is in abundance, and as we can consume as much as water as we can, and because we consume more water, we just have little or lower marginal utility for water. In view of that, we'll be willing to spend less money to get water. But with minerals such as gold, diamond are very rare. In view of that, people will have higher marginal utility for it. Therefore, they'll be willing to spend millions and thousands of cedis and dollars to get the diamond. But water, it exists everywhere. We've been consuming it literally every day. So the marginal utility that we derive from the consumption of water is very low, to the point that we'll be willing to pay less to get water. That brings us to the end of today's video. I'll leave a link to the multiple choice questions below the video, and also I'll leave a link for the lecture slide also in the video so you can access them and then you try your hands on the multiple choice questions. This is also a trial example, so you can try it in your free time. So thanks for watching and see you in the next video.